Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Salt Vlog or Salt Stream or Salt Wave or whatever this is going to be called. I'm going to call it something that's not any of those three. I'll come up with something new after making the video. But no live stream this time, just shooting a video. As for the regularity of this channel, as to whether it'll be a live stream or pre-recorded or when I publish, like what the schedule is or how often, the answer to all of that is whenever the fuck I feel like it. And yeah, but I feel like I'm putting out stuff, frequently enough that make people happy if this is the kind of thing you want to see. Talking about some obscure, giant, heavy philosophical tome or sociological tome that may or may not have any relevance to our current lives. Although it does, actually. So that's the thing. I've been trying to relate this to modern politics as we've been going through the text. But I think that, recent events have really... I'm seeing them now through the lens of the work of Robert Michels. So something that just happened in the United States. Neera Tanden is a person who was nominated to the Office of Management and Budget, which we will call OMB. It's a very important office. The thing is, Neera Tanden, she's a very divisive figure, even within the Democratic Party. She's a longtime Clinton ally. I mean, she's like, she comes out of the Center for American Progress, which is basically it's a Clintonite think tank, a neoliberal think tank that was more or less positioned after the 2016 election, supposing Hillary would have won, to take a huge role in charting the course forward of governance for steering the ship of state. That would have involved Neera Tanden. But this person has been known for, like she punched one of her own staffers in the chest for asking a pointed question to Hillary Clinton. The infamous thing everyone talks about is in one email, she said that we should bomb Libya and take their oil because we're just going to have to be engaged. The U.S. military war machine is going to have to be engaged on the world stage indefinitely, and we all know that, and we should accept it as a reality, so we might as well get paid for it. Which is a position... Who else argued for that? 3 guesses. I mean, the one that should come to your mind first is Donald Trump. He made that argument all the time, that we shouldn't be engaged in these foreign wars, which Neera Tanden allegedly believes as well. Both of them, I don't think they actually believe it, but they say, we really shouldn't be doing this. But if we are, we shouldn't be shafted for doing it. We should get paid for doing it. We should be getting our fair share of it. Trump spoke in those very realpolitik manner and that sort of style of speaking about these issues when he talked about Saudi Arabia and our weapons deals with them. If we don't take their money, who else is going to take their money? It's going to be Russia or China, so we might as well take it. NATO. Why are we paying for the brunt of, or the lion's share of the cost for NATO? Why aren't all these other countries paying their fair share? And famously in Syria, well, if we're going to be over there creating security for the Syrian state, which is what they say they're doing. You could argue whether that's what they're actually doing. Securing these oil fields, we should be securing that so that we can expropriate that oil. That should be ours as to pay for the cost of all of these military expenditures. So Neera Tanden has foreign policy views that are basically indistinguishable from the Trump wing of the Republican Party, because they're really not so different after all, are they? But in any case, so that's who she is, but the main thing, what they've turned the conversation into on cable news is all about mean tweets. And that was the reason why she was objected to by a lot of conservative senators who didn't want to confirm her because she had, said vampires have more heart than Ted Cruz and, said awful things. Perhaps my favorite thing in the hearing was one senator from Louisiana, whose name escapes me at the moment, was saying, I love to engage. I love the dialectic. but the name calling, you've called Senator Sanders just about everything but an ignorant slut. Which is like, what? Like, why would you? And, that was one of her big targets, was Bernie Sanders, who is now chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate. So this nomination by the Biden administration, this very divisive, culturally divisive figure to the head of the Office of Management and Budget, who's like insulted and said very horrible things about Bernie Sanders because he's not a Democrat, he's an independent, and they hate him for being the radical left flank of their own party. So Neera Tanden hated him, obviously, because she comes right out of the Clintonite clique of the Democratic Party. And this was sort of presented like it was a sop to the left or to the progressives because she says such radical left things on Twitter. But in reality, her policies, as I've said, on foreign policy, she's basically indistinguishable from Trump. All the people who were in the hashtag resistance, all the senators and Justice Democrats and all these people, they all, they voted right along with approving these bloated military budgets for Trump to command. That's his military as the commander-in-chief. When he was president, they voted for these obscene military budgets, and they had no problem with approving all of his judges. And so the differences on policy really not that distinct when it comes to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, especially on things like foreign policy. So in any case, that whole thing happened. But so to bring it home to Michels, what does that make me think of? Well, the Justice Democrats have been presented as a sort of a route to reforming the Democratic Party. If you don't know who the Justice Democrats are, they were a movement started by the likes of both Cenk Uygur and Kyle Kulinski, but then various other people as well, in the wake of the 2016 election, with the idea of an electoralist strategy for seizing control of the Democratic Party from within. That you would elect these far left progressives from the left flank of the Democratic Party, and they would push the party left. And they arguably had success with this insofar as their candidates, they had like 4 candidates win in 2018. They became known as the Squad, and they were outperforming, primarying these candidates with way more money flowing from the Democratic establishment. So that was very impressive, and it looked like a genuinely revolutionary front within the party, right? And now we were up to like 7 or 8 members, or it might be more than that. I don't know who's formally considered to be part of the Squad, but it's growing, and we can reasonably expect that the caucus of Justice Democrats will get bigger as we go on. I think they will continue to see success because many liberals are uncomfortable with the idea that they are not as far left as they could be, and they want to show it in any way they could possibly can. But they don't want to do any activism or like labor organizing or anything of that nature. The most thing that most people can even conceive of for taking political action is in the form of electoral politics, where you just vote, or you help a candidate get elected, you become a campaign staff or something, or you become an activist or an advocate, where you then lobby for things within the existing political structure. Now, the Justice Democrats, I guess you could say then, are they a good theory of the case for how you could reform the Democratic Party? And I would say in practice, no. And I think what we're witnessing here is these same forces that Michels has identified. Because what just happened? Well, the likes of Joe Manchin, who's an incredibly conservative candidate, was saying, I'm not going to vote for Neera Tanden. I won't approve her to the cabinet. Why was he doing this? Well, he's a senator from West Virginia, and the big problem that has become the big divide in America is culture war stuff. And so, as a cultural figure, Neera Tanden appears left because she's very mean to right-wing people on Twitter. She's a partisan, and she speaks in very strong radical language. So Joe Manchin doesn't like that because he's a centrist conservative Democrat. Now, Joe Manchin is a complete piece of garbage. He's one of the most corrupt people in Congress. And, it's like the money he takes from all sorts of corporate interests. I mean, I could go on. I don't want to go into Joe Manchin too much. I don't like him. He's a conservative. But he might have been the main thing that blunted her her forward motion of getting the votes she needed, that he might have just said, no, I'm not going to do that, because the Biden administration ultimately withdrew her nomination. But the people who did come out in support of Neera Tanden were the Justice Democrats, including, I believe, the current chairwoman, whose name also escapes me, went on, I believe, MSNBC to say it's Joe Manchin who's being divisive. We have qualified person. Neera Tanden's a qualified person. We need all hands on deck during this pandemic. We need to get to work. Why are you opposing this qualified person getting into this position? And so what do you have here? You have the supposedly radical left flank of the party taking sides on cultural signifier lines, on the kinds of things people are willing to say and signal, which is what Neera Tanden is good at, against the person Joe Manchin, who tends to signal, I'm an old school conservative Democrat, and I don't agree with all your social justice crap. That's his signaling. And that's how he wins and holds a seat in West Virginia, by the way. There's a reason for that. But all that being said, but who are they taking a stand against? They're taking a stand against working people, the working class, whom Neera Tanden, the big thing about her that I haven't mentioned actually, is her disturbing comments on cutting Social Security and entitlement spending and welfare and Medicare, Medicaid. She's talked about cutting all this stuff. And you can look up the clips. It's they're all over the place. Because she said it multiple times. That's probably why Biden nominated her, because Biden's often talked about the grand bargain that we're eventually going to have to cut into Social Security and Medicare, and strike some sort of bargain with the Republicans on those lines. So Neera Tanden's in that exact same camp. So she's against the entitlements programs that I personally, look, yes, in principle, I'm against them as well, because I believe in like a basic income, and better ways of pumping capital resources into the bottom, because it'll just trickle up again. But there are ways to reform our system so that some control over the resources passes through the hands of the neediest before it accumulates into the hands of the few again. You can claw it back from the wealthy. The rich will still get it. You have to find some sort of mechanism to skim a little bit off the top and give it back to the bottom. But that's not where Neera Tanden's coming from. She is basically, when really pushed on this stuff, she propounds the bootstrap ideology that you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And by the way, she often uses the fact that she used these entitlement programs when she was younger as evidence of the fact that she comes from a hardscrabble background and she knows what it's like. And therefore, she knows that we can afford to cut these programs. So she's coming at it from a neoliberal, pseudo-libertarian bootstrap ideology. Cut these programs; they're too expensive, and people need to figure it out. Ideology, not the idea we need to reform them so they need to be better. So she's against working people. She hates Bernie Sanders. She hates his assault on the party, and the Justice Democrats came out and spoke in favor of her. They all, as a bloc, more or less agreed to support her. And the argument's been made that the Biden administration fought harder to put her in than they have for a $15 minimum wage, which is one of the most popular parts of their platform, that there does seem to be some possibility that they could get realized. That's a whole separate issue. The point being, so why would the Justice Democrats behave that way? Take a side against workers and against Bernie Sanders, who is by far and away the most popular politician with working people. And he was definitely the most popular politician in America. In terms of, I should say, how he was the most popular. He was, among his own constituents, the most approved of, and then I think nationally had the highest approval rating. At least at one point. I don't know if he is anymore. So in any case, it's like the Justice Democrats, what are they doing? They're ultimately becoming integrated into the interests of the Democratic Party. Their interests have begun to align. All the people who are Justice Democrats have already become elected. They now have access to, power, influence, some sort of stability and security for their identity and status within the system that is maintained so long as they behave themselves within the current power structures. And those power structures, those sociological structures, begin doing their work on them as soon as they get into the Democratic Party politics, until they are openly supporting a candidate who stands against everything they claim to believe. Is in some sense, Neera Tanden, as a candidate for the Office of Management and Budget, in some sense is like the epitome of the kind of person, the kind of swamp that these Justice Democrats were coming to drain, if you'll pardon the Trumpian rhetoric. I mean, I think it's appropriate, though, because like Donald Trump, these people were... I was about to say they're liars. I think they actually believe we're going to go in and reform the party. But like Trump, they're unable to do that. They don't have the ability to do that. And part of why they can't do that is because of their own motivations and how they've changed how it transforms you once you start to hold public office. And that becomes, your ability to get elected and hold those offices and get things done within the office, which means working with your party leadership, exerts its force on you to where you're like, I have to be a team player. It's too divisive right now. It's so funny. Jimmy Dore brought this up, that Cenk Uygur then tweeted out, they'll probably replace Neera Tanden with somebody even worse and even more conservative. Right? And what Jimmy Dore said is like, what? It's never the time to fight. You can always forestall it. You always say, well, we just have to circle the wagons right now and stand up for our own party right now, and we'll fight later. You see how that always works? You can always say we're going to fight later. And what does that do? It has a worse, you get a worse outcome than if you had never decided to collaborate with those people, because you could have been spending that time and those resources and that effort to shape a third party. And everyone says that that's pie in the sky of a third party, but I'm more or less convinced, having read through this whole book now, and now reading through the end of it again with you, that the strategy of going through a political party to achieve change and achieve reform within the system is far more outlandish and far crazier than the idea of starting a third party. Now, the third party is going to be subject to these forces too, and eventually that third party will become what the Democrats and the Republicans are now. But what we all have to remember is the Democratic Party once was the party of FDR. So it did transform over time into something awful. And you have kind of a ship of Theseus thing there, because long before FDR, the Democratic Party was certainly something awful. But are all of these things still the same Democratic Party? I would argue no. I would argue that the modern version of the Democratic Party really has nothing to do with the party of FDR, the party of working people. It's a party of a professional class. It's a party of people who they care about a certain moral code. They're on a moral crusade. They have certain cultural signifiers and certain cultural signals that they want to send. It's about messaging. It's about representation. It's not about fundamental change. It's not about empowering working people. And it's not about averting even the coming climate catastrophe or the fastly approaching neo-techno feudalism under the Jeff Bezos fucking boot on your throat, the Facebook fucking boot on your throat. These things are. This is like we're a train racing off of a cliff, and we're slapping a rainbow sticker on the train, is what the Democratic Party is doing. Meanwhile, the Republican Party is saying there is no cliff. This will go on forever. So that's a very facile analysis as well. But if you watch this channel and you've seen my vlogs and rants in the past, and you continue to watch, you'll see I can analyze it on a much deeper level than that. This is very complicated, and there are things that both parties do. I mean, I was just arguing on the last live stream I did that the Democrats are actually worse than the Republicans because they put the left to sleep. And that's largely what the squad is doing. They're serving as a vessel for all of that energy, the revolutionary energy, all that rage, all of that is being funneled into a dead end. It's a channel that has been dug off from that to siphon off energy, discontentment, popular rage, and the sense of alienation and immiseration that's wanting to come out and burst and destroy the existing system, which we've already seen an outburst of that from the right-wing side, the Capitol insurrection. You could argue that the George Floyd protests were an outburst on the left-wing side. But they're just tantrums, and the people in charge think, well, we just have to let them wear themselves out. And meanwhile, another safety valve for that is having these politicians in, these party structures that are fundamentally rotten and stagnant and have these entrenched oligarchies within them that are mostly insulated from the will of the people. Those party structures they allow for the radical to appear within their ranks for the sole sake of giving you the impression that that radicalism is what that party stands for, and that that's actually what they're working towards, and that at least they have this representative, and maybe there's this chance. I mean, the Progressive Caucus, the way it is now, the Progressive Caucus of today, that is not at all economically progressive, that's what the squad will be in the future. And I think I've said this before, but the Justice Democrats, as their caucus grows and they elect more members, will just become another wing of the Democratic Party, who ultimately, functionally, regardless of what their ideology is, will become in action more conservative and will basically just be loyal Democrats. We could argue all day, like, in the ways that AOC is different from Nancy Pelosi, to take the starkest examples, which I would agree they're not the same. And I can give praise for AOC all day as much as I can criticize her. But the fact of the matter is, that's kind of a red herring, isn't it? Looking at each individual politician as like, well, they have good beliefs. I think their heart's in the right place. I think they're trying to realize it, and they're just, I think they're one of the good politicians versus one of the bad politicians. It ends up being another form of just social, cultural signaling of which side you're on. But more than that, it's just missing the point, because we're not talking about, like, is this individual have good intentions or bad intentions, or are they good at being a politician or bad, or are they effective or ineffective? Because one congressperson doesn't run Congress. What the relevant level to look at this is the whole structure, the macrostructure, the superstructure. How do they vote at the end of the day? As a whole, how does Congress as a body vote at the end of the day? What actually gets passed? What actually gets done? Who has the most control over the levers of power? And how do the social realities shape that of who controls those levers behave? And the reality is, the more entrenched you become and the more subject to those oligarchical forces you become, the more removed you become from democracy, the less progressive you become, the more conservative you become. And so it shouldn't surprise anyone that the Justice Democrats would, a month ago or so, dismiss as absolute madness the idea of withholding their vote from Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, demanding that they get something in exchange, basically dismissing it's the wrong time, this is the wrong strategy, we can't fight for this. People were saying they wanted them to do it to get a floor vote for Medicare for all. So the same people who argued, people can't wait for Medicare for all, we need a floor vote now, we need universal health care in this country, immediately, not by incremental measures, those same people argued against that same position. And so, but they were willing to go on MSNBC and fight for Neera Tanden's nomination, someone who is, by all appearances, against everything they believe. But she's an important fundraiser for the party. She's part of the inner clique of a very influential wing of the party. And ultimately, they have identified themselves more with the party, at least culturally, than with, the cause of taking up for the ordinary worker. And it's the same old story. So let's get into Michels after that introductory rant. So we're going to talk about part 4, the social analysis of leadership. What What he talks about in this part is almost exclusively the role of particularly the bourgeoisie and the socialist parties. So again, Michels is primarily talking about socialist parties because socialist parties are, by definition, opposed to things like oligarchies and aristocracies. They're supposed to be, whether you would say or not that democracy doesn't have to imply socialism, they're arguing for the most radical form of democracy possible, rule by all the people. And so they should, if an oligarchy forms there, how does that happen? It shows you that it's not simply a matter of oligarchies form because people ideologically want there to be oligarchies. That's not the case. They happen as a natural outgrowth of how parties function. And so here he's talking about the bourgeois and their role in socialist parties. So, as he points out, the bourgeoisie have always had a role in socialist parties, from the petite bourgeois to even the rich. Oftentimes they faced social stigma in their own day for declaring themselves as socialists and were completely ostracized by high society, but found a new home and a new family within the Socialist Party. What he points out here, though, is that the bourgeois, some of he challenges a lot of the narratives about them in socialist politics in this part. So let's get into it. In chapter 1, he starts right off on page 227 saying, "The masses are not easily stirred. Great events pass before their eyes, and revolutions are accomplished in economic life without their minds undergoing profound modifications. Very slowly do they react to the influence of new conditions." So the reason why he's bringing that up is we might reference examples we've talked about in the past of how apathetic voters can be, and even when it's issues that could have profound effect on their life, sometimes they can't even be roused to do anything about it. So what he argues then is that it's oftentimes some sort of leader who emerges, and oftentimes that leader comes from the elite, the cohorts of the elite that we might think of. Caesar is a great example. He was a patrician, but he was in the party of the populares, which was the party speaking for the welfare of the whole people, not just for the upper class, which was the optimates, the party of the best men. Caesar was a patrician. He was of noble birth. He was of a good family. And when I say a good family, I mean everyone knew Caesar's family and respected Caesar's family. But he stood with the common people. And so Michels' argument is whether that person is literally of nobility or not, oftentimes what is required in order to gain class consciousness in the Marxist sense, some degree of education. And it's very hard to get an education when you're, working in a coal mine. You don't have time to come home and study reading. And, if you can't read and write, you're not going to get the ideas of Marx or Hegel. People might spontaneously come to an awareness or an intuition of their class consciousness, but very rarely are they able to articulate that into any kind of coherent message that could actually stir up their fellows into organizing for something like a revolution. And so, and even when that does happen, as Michels has been pointed out throughout the text, you naturally elevate some people to be the leaders where they're going to have duties and tasks that take them away from the reality of being a worker. And so masses are not easily stirred. You need some sort of elite or a leader of some kind, whatever their background, to move them. So he talks about how for decades or even centuries, the masses continue to endure passively outworn political conditions, which greatly impede legal and moral progress. Further down, he says, these historical phenomena, which at first sight appear paradoxical, arise from two different causes. In the first place, it may happen that classes or subclasses representing an extinct economic form may survive from a time in which they were the authentic exponents of the then dominant economic relationships. They have been able to save from the wreck a sufficiency of moral prestige and effectively political force to maintain their dominion in the new phase of economic and civil development, and do this even in opposition to the express majority of the people. So that's an example of an entrenched aristocracy that hails from an older time and has managed to preserve itself, even though the social or political conditions might suggest that things ought to change. The zeitgeist can't displace this old order. But he says that more often, this is on page 228, a sense of fatalism and a sad conviction of impotence exercise a paralyzing influence in social life. As long as an oppressed class is influenced by this fatalistic spirit, as long as it has failed to develop an adequate sense of social injustice, it is incapable of aspiring towards emancipation. It is not the simple existence of oppressive conditions, but is the recognition of these conditions by the oppressed, which history has constituted the prime factor of class struggle. So again, Orwell had to have read this for Goldstein's text. That's one of the points Goldstein explicitly makes, that as to why it's always, when he says, remember, he gives the example. You have the high, the aristocrats, the middle, which are the aspirant elites, the bureaucrats, the professionals, etc., and the low, who are laborers and workers whose labor is exploited to extract a surplus for those higher up on the food chain. What Goldstein alleges in that text is it's always the middle who riles up or agitates. Even though Michels dismisses that as saying, the source of class struggle just doesn't wholly come from an agitator. Like, the people do have a legitimate grievance, but they need somebody from the middle, so educated, professional, to tell them, to explain to them how they're being exploited, because it might not be obvious to them, that they need somebody to wake them up, so to speak. And what does he say? The mere existence of the modern proletariat does not suffice per se to produce a social problem. That's how they often spoke about inequality, was the social problem. And so it is the involuntary work of the bourgeoisie to arouse in the proletariat that class consciousness which is necessarily directed against the bourgeoisie itself. History is full of such ironies. It is the tragical destiny of the bourgeoisie to be the instructor of the class, which from the economic and social point of view is its own deadly enemy. As Karl Marx showed in his Communist Manifesto, the principal reason for this is found in the unceasing struggle which the bourgeoisie is forced to carry out at once with the aristocracy, with those sections of its own class whose interests are opposed to industrial progress, and with the bourgeoisie of all foreign countries. Unable to carry on the struggle effectively by its own unaided powers, the bourgeoisie is continually forced to appeal to the proletariat to demand its aid, and thus to launch the proletariat into the political melee, thus putting into the hands of the proletariat a weapon which the latter will turn against the bourgeoisie itself. So this is his origin story for why the bourgeoisie is always involved in socialist movements, because that's their role. It's a natural thing that, and he goes on to explain, as we'll get into throughout this part, why that's always their role, but that the people who become educated are able to then perceive the oppression that's happening, which would have been unconscious to them had they not gotten that education. And again, I don't think Michels is arguing, and I would not argue that it's impossible for a working person to perceive this, but Michels simply appeals to history to say, in general, that's not enough. It's not enough for enough people, just simply the abject state of their own condition manifest before them in everyday life. It's actually not enough to wake people up truly to their class position. And so there's always, it's the role of the middle class to get that education that wakes them up to the idea of oppression, and then to realize, things like morality, things like that there are codes of morality and justice that they might be breaking, but through their very own actions, through being part of the system. And so they become, they become the instructors of the proletariat, which ultimately arrays the proletarians against them, because they are also the enemy as much as the aristocracy, if not more so, because they are the facilitators of it, and they're the more immediate target for the proletarians. Um, and so, yeah, and Michels says on page 229, proletarian mass is at first aware by instinct alone of the oppression by which it is burdened. For it entirely lacks the instruction which might give a clue to understanding of the historical process, which is in appearance so confused and labyrinthian. It would seem to be a psychological, historical law that any class which has been enervated and led to despair in itself through prolonged lack of education and through deprivation of political rights cannot attain to the possibility of energetic action until it has received instruction concerning its ethical rights and politico-economical powers. So, again, to draw on 1984, we remember it's the high class, therefore, is, or in 1984, the inner party, is not really most afraid of the proles. They're most afraid of the outer party. Because these are the people, the aspirant elites, who are going to displace them. And they're the ones who could foment revolution among the proles. So, Michels puts forward this model that this is how it always works. And so, there's always going to be a bourgeois element to the socialist movement. Paradoxically, it's also against the bourgeoisie as an institution. The socialist theory has arisen out of the reflections of the philosophers, economists, sociologists, and historians. So, or what does he say? In the socialist programs of different countries, every word represents a synthesis of the work of numerous learned men. So the entire socialist ideology that we're even talking about here is a bourgeois product. It doesn't really come from the working class as a theory. The socialist project. Oh, and then to explain this by empirical example, he gives on page 230, says every great class movement in history has arisen upon the instigation with cooperation and under the leadership of men sprung from the very class against which the movement was directed. Spartacus, who urged the slaves to revolt on behalf of their freedom, was, it is true, of servile origin, but he was a freedman, a Thracian property owner. Thomas Munzer, to whose agitation the Thuringian Peasants' War was largely due, was not a peasant but a man of learning. Florian Geyer was a knight. The most distinguished leaders of the movement for the emancipation of the tiers d'état at the outset of the French Revolution, Lafayette, Mirabeau, Roland, and Sieyès, belonged to the privileged classes. In Philippe Égalité, the regicide was even a member of the royal house. The history of the modern labor movement furnishes no exception to this rule. When the German historian Theodor Lindner affirms that the contemporary socialist movement is always called to life by non-workers, we must indeed criticize the statement, which recalls to our mind that the working of the necromancer's magic wand. Let there be a labor movement, and there was a labor movement. Lindner's statement is likewise inexact and incomplete because it fails to recognize that this calling to life cannot produce something out of nothing, and that it cannot be the work of one of those famous great men, whom a certain school of historians make the cornerstone of their theory. But Lindner's view, though badly formulated, is to this extent true, that the heralds of the modern labor movement are chiefly derived from the cultured classes. And he goes on to say Marx, Engels, and Robertus were all bourgeois intellectuals. Louis Blanqui, and Lassalle, the fathers of economic and scientific socialism, all bourgeois intellectuals. That's fairly compelling to me. And I don't see how you can escape this problem because, I'm sure, as he says, they're not getting something out of nothing. There's always been an instinctual knowledge among the proletarians of their oppression. And there have been labor movements and revolutions all over the world that weren't necessarily directly influenced by socialist theories. But the preservation of ideas by people who are now dead amongst those who are now living only survives really among the professional intellectual class, as it always has. That's and even people who might have come from a lowly origin, to the extent that we know their theories, to the extent that they were able to be free from abject poverty and wage slavery or whatever other kind of slavery in order to learn to read and write and actually write and correspond and learn. In fact, you have to learn a lot of these. You have to learn a great deal before you can contribute any sort of political theory that's going to be worth anything. And so, in practice, a lot of them do just come straight out of the upper classes. But even those who are of self-made origin become bourgeois. if we're reading their ideas, more or less they have. And so he says, the presence of bourgeois elements in the proletarian movement organized to form a political party is a historical fact, and one which may be noted wherever the political movement of the international working class is attentively observed. This phenomenon reproduces itself wherever the socialist tree throws out new branches, as may be seen, for example, in Japan and Brazil, which I don't know anything about those. He says on page 233, he quotes Pareto, or he says that Pareto pointed out, this is Michels' words, the permeation of a dominant class by humanitarian ideas, which lead that class to doubt its own moral right to existence, demoralizes the members and makes them inept for defense. Sort of an explanation as to why this always finds purchase it comes from a what education can bring on, that sense of self-doubt and the idea of like, oh, I mean, it's what the white fragility left is feeling now, right? People who really perceive, they're like, oh, white people were really oppressive and horrible. We should be torn down from our position of power. I don't, there's a lot of reasons why I don't necessarily agree with a lot of like critical race theories, because I think they oversimplify a lot of things, and they get too caught up in the historical analysis to really comprehend just how different the modern day can be and how quickly attitudes can change. And I think they're just generally dismissive of like a lot of alternative views whenever I've dialogued with these people. But it's that same, anytime that there's a, like that, we see it now too when all the billionaires at Davos like want to self-flagellate about how bad capitalism is. And so, where are we here? He talks about the example he gives on 234 is no social struggle in history has ever been permanently won unless the vanquished has, as a preliminary measure, been morally weakened. He talks about the French Revolution was preceded by all these French Enlightenment writers. That's why Nietzsche always had a very complicated relationship with these people, because he found a lot of truth and a lot of worth in the words of someone like Voltaire, but that they paved the way for, especially like Rousseau, for example, paved the way for this devastating critique of the way the society was being run. And if you think, as Nietzsche did, that revolutions are inherently harmful because of the same things that Michels is saying here, that you're not going to destroy those power structures. This is sort of the problem with this thinking that underlies all this type of thinking of this masochistic moralist self-indictment, is that it always leads to this notion of like, well, what if we could tear down all power structures and have a truly egalitarian society? And the problem is, whenever you organize to do that, which you're going to have to do, you create a new power structure. So the people who were reactionaries during the period of the heyday of like socialism coming into its own, 1800s, a lot of those people, I think, had a very rational concern that you're going to have this revolution and you're just going to establish like something else that might even be worse. Some new tyranny. It will not actually solve the old problem. Now, I think with a little bit of like healthy self-reflection, now that we're in the 2020s, we can look back and say, yeah, getting rid of hereditary monarchy, probably a good idea. But it creates, actually what a lot of the critical theorists or the Frankfurt School were very concerned with was how the state had become this all-encompassing, totalizing thing that could now have unprecedented authoritarian control over everyone's lives. And people were, now that we don't have these hereditary dynasties, forming parties around an ideology that were then seizing power and being able to do unprecedented things with levers of power that never existed before, controlling nuclear weapons, for example, or nowadays with the NSA and how sophisticated our surveillance is. And so being very concerned with and very critical of someone else's ideology, especially in things like, race, when you see like, to use the obvious example, how ideology took the Nazis into power and had a horrific effect on the Jewish race living within Germany and in other parts that the Nazis conquered. yeah, it's like it's an understandable concern of like we need to be hyper focused on critiquing ideologies that could be hateful, because like it's ideological coalescence around, um, I guess I'm saying like breaking through the hereditary structures and allowing for party politics allows for these coalescent ideological structures to seize power very quickly over states that were more powerful than they'd ever been. And so I think, we should be suspicious of revolutions. I don't think that's completely crazy to say so, because with the idea that the prospect that your revolution is going to turn out, perfectly well, is not obvious at all. When in America we have a bias because we had a very successful revolution. We had a very large moat between us and the people we were revolting against. So anyway, that's all kind of a sidetrack. We'll move on. We'll move on to chapter 2. He analyzes the bourgeois elements of leadership. It's called the analysis of the bourgeois elements of socialist leadership. And he talks about sort of the phenomenon that we've talked about before, so I'll just kind of briefly cover it, that, the son of a wealthy capitalist who decides to align himself with socialism can lose everything within his existing social structure or his family structure. And so he becomes very dependent on the Socialist Party for his identity and his way of life from that point forward. And so he talks about how there's different kinds of people and different reasons why people are drawn in. He says some people just burn with this fire of ideological purity, and they want to take the next step. They want to prove it to themselves and to the world, and actually do some good. There are some who he calls the men of science. These would be, the economists and social scientists, also men of professional class background, who really do just believe socialism is the best way for communism to work. He says that the people who were doing it out of a sort of like moral fire burning in them, they do tend to burn out. And the problem is a lot of those people, they don't have anything to go back to, and so they just sort of become party functionaries as a career and depend on that for their way of life. And so they're sort of stuck in it. And that's another force creating conservative elements of your party. Because again, when that's your way of life is the party politics, that's your lifeblood. That's where you get paid from. That's what your identity is based on. That's what your career, that's all your social, professional relations. You don't want to lose that, and you have a completely divergent set of interests from a working person. And that only increases. He says the men of science, the people who really believe this based on some theory, they do tend to be stauncher, more firmly believing socialists even very late into their career, and will still contribute a great deal. Let's see here. We'll move on to chapter 3, social changes resulting from organization. And this is sort of a chapter where he lays out various, reasons why an embourgeoisement happens to the party. The bourgeoisification of the Socialist Party. He sort of just charts out how this happens. Because we've already said, he establishes in chapter 1 his framework of like, this is why this always happens. Because it's a natural role for the middle class to enlighten the lower class as to their oppression. As a matter of course, that will happen. And then chapter 2, we're talking about, the different kinds of people who would get in. And then he sort of says, this is how this plays out. So he says, the adhesion of the petty bourgeois to the proletarian parties. I'll just read it. For motives predominantly electoral, the party of the workers seeks support from the petty bourgeois elements of society and gives rise to more or less extensive relations upon the party itself. The Labor Party becomes the party of the people. Its appeals are no longer addressed simply to manual workers, but to all producers, to the entire working population. These phrases being applied to all the classes and all the strata of society except the idlers who live upon the income of investments. Both the friends and the enemies of the Socialist Party have frequently pointed out that the petty bourgeois members tend more and more to predominate over the manual workers. During the struggles which occurred during the early part of 1890 in the German Socialist Party against the so-called youths, the assertion that during recent years complete transposition of power had occurred within the party aroused a veritable tempest. On one side, it was maintained that the proletarian elements were to an increasing extent being thrust into the background by the petty bourgeois. The other faction repudiated this accusation as calumny, which means, like a false accusation. Fun fact, in ancient Rome, if you were found guilty of being a calumniator, they would, of making a false accusation, you could be branded with the letter K on your forehead, which stood for that. So there was a very serious, charge to be a false accuser in ancient Rome that was intended to discourage that. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So he's kind of pointing out how the petit bourgeois becomes part of the party, and how their rhetoric changes so they speak on behalf of the whole people, all the working people. Very common social democratic talk. Very common among the Democratic Party today. This is all so applicable to the Democratic Party. A little less so the Republican Party, but this book really explains a lot of that. What does he say? The embourgeoisement of the party is an unquestionable fact, but its causes will be found in a process very different from the entry into organizations of the fighting proletariat of a few hundred members of the middle class. The chief of these causes is the metamorphosis which takes place in the leaders of working class origin, with the resulting embourgeoisement of the whole atmosphere in which the political activities of the party are carried on. So, what he's saying here, there's a reason why the bourgeois are attracted to these parties. The party wants the bourgeois. They're valuable members. They will try to attract them. And furthermore, the labor leaders within the parties undergo an embourgeoisement themselves. They become declassed. They're no longer they become deproletarianized as they rise to leadership. And that's another part of this chapter. He talks about labor organization as the creator of a new petty bourgeois strata. What does he say? This is another thing that relates directly to the Democratic Party. They assign all their committee assignments of who chairs them by strict seniority. On page 258, Michels says, an ex-member of the German Socialist Party, who some years ago, having entered the service of one of the bourgeois parties, amused himself by caricaturing his former comrades, declared that the whole party organization, with all its various degrees of propagandist activity, was, quote, cut upon the military model, and that the members were promoted by seniority. And so that's all very familiar. That's how things run. What does he say? Oh, there's a fun quote from Bismarck where he says, one of the first persons to recognize the bearing of these possibilities and to utilize them with considerable partisan exaggeration for his own peculiar political ends was Prince Bismarck. During the violent struggle between the government and the Socialist Party, he declared, quote, the position of socialist agitator has today become a regular industry, just like any other. A man becomes an agitator or a popular orator, as in former days he became a smith or a carpenter. One who adopts this new occupation is often much better off than if he had kept at his old work, gaining a more agreeable and freer life, one that in certain circles brings him more respect. So we see how he identifies, Michels grants, this is a partisan statement from an enemy, but from everything we've been reading, it's a true critique. There's a kernel of truth in it. That's why it's such a good shot to take at the Socialist Party, because it's true. It creates a whole nother strata, a whole nother class of person that has a very different life from manual labor or a smith. He has more free time, and he has more respect in society. So what else do we have here? Oh, on page 263, it says Karl Marx himself did not hesitate to classify the working class leaders under two heads, as Hochklassige, which are the workers of the superior class, the intellectual workers, and Arbeiter, which is manual workers properly speaking. So, yeah, there's always been this sort of acknowledgement, even within the socialist parties, that he gives many more examples of. Here we have another example. Wilhelm Liebknecht apostrophized the other leaders in the following terms of the socialist bureaucracy of his party. He says, "You are for the most part aristocrats among the workers. Aristocrats, I mean, in terms of income. The workers in the Erzgebirge or the weavers of Silesia would regard the salaries you earn as the income of a Croesus." Croesus, of course, very, very rich figure from classical antiquity stories, like legendary amount of wealth. So he's saying to a silk weaver in one of these unpronounceable towns, or a manual worker, you are an aristocrat. And so they're the labor aristocrats. He also talks about these people in a subsequent chapter. And then in part 3, he says the capitalist defense as the creator of a new petty bourgeois strata. And the main example he uses are the tavern owners, who become a sort of party within the party. He says that in a lot of places in Germany at the time, if you wanted to have a socialist party meeting, plenty of taverns would say, no, you can't have that here. And the tavern's like the public meeting place. That's the public, that's... Today we have social media. They had the tavern. They had a place to get together and discuss political ideas and organize. And arguably today we still need physical spaces to organize. The best organizing is still in IRL. But in those days, the tavern was like the only reasonable place you could do it. And so the socialist tavern keeps had incredible influence. They became sort of an aristocracy within the Socialist Party, to where he describes then, once you had a union of the socialist tavern keeps, it was like a party within a party. The amount of influence that they collectively had dwarfed any of the other factions. So that mostly will wrap it up for that chapter. Chapter 4, in this section, he talks about the need for the differentiation of the working class. And more or less, he's just sort of talking about how even the workers themselves make differentiations. This is a very, this kind of chapter is probably anathema to a lot of very, left-leaning egalitarian people, because it is, the biggest exponent of this kind of view in modern times is, Jordan Peterson, who talks about, natural dominance hierarchies and things like that. So we don't have to take a stand that it's, natural and that we're all lobsters. But what he says is... as early as 1860, it was said, quote, "Among the workers there are many categories and an aristocratic stratification. Printers take the lead, rag pickers, scavengers, and sewermen close the line." And he's quoting from a translation of Edmund About. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he's talking about laborers in Paris. And on page 273, he says, "The need for differentiation is manifested still more clearly when we consider more extended groups of workers. The difference between skilled and unskilled workers is primarily and predominantly economic, and displays itself in a difference of working conditions. As time passes, this difference becomes transformed into a veritable class distinction. The skilled and better paid workers hold aloof from the unskilled and worse paid workers." Typically, too, the skilled workers are the ones who can unionize, because they actually have skills that their labor is valuable in the way that not everyone can do it. You can't just put anyone in there. And so if all of them get together and form a union, it's actually kind of powerful. Whereas unskilled labor, in principle, will always have trouble guarding itself against what we would call scabs or strikebreakers. And so for a variety of reasons, just skilled workers become a class distinction from the unskilled. And so that's even within what we would call, if we're doing that very simple 3-part stratification of society, within the lower class of the proletarians or the plebeians or just the working people, you have tiers within that, and the workers will set up tiers themselves. And so Michels is pointing out, so then when we witness this in party life, why would we be surprised by that? It's made up by the same people who make all these social stratifications within their own communities. Why would those fail to exist within party life, especially when you vastly elevate some people over others in terms of power, the respect they get, the income they get. You create an embourgeoisement. So, also on page 273, he talks about some very important concept. This struggle, which by the physiologist Angelo Mosso is termed ergomachia, the struggle for the feeding ground, is waged with ever-increasing intensity. The organized workers demand from the unorganized the strictest solidarity and insist that the latter should abandon work whenever they themselves are in conflict with the employers. When this demand is not immediately complied with, they then insult the unorganized workers by the use of opprobrious names. So they have found, and he talks about, actually, in Germany, they call them strikebreaker. In Italy, crumiri. In England, blacklegs. In America, scabs. And so on, so on. There's a bunch of other ones. And so he says on page 274, in reality, ergomachia does not consist of a struggle between two categories distinguished by ethical characteristics, but is for the most part a war between the better paid workers and the poor strata of the proletariat. That's a great point. It's not that, they make it into a moral struggle. When strikebreakers or scabs come in, so the classic examples in America were they didn't let a lot of the black people unionize. So oftentimes when a company needed to break a strike, it was people of color who were coming in, and you had white skilled laborers, organized labor unions on strike, watching people of color scabs going in to do their job, and to help this company break the strike. And so for one, that drives culture war, that drives racial divisions, even though if they had let the black people into the union with them, they could all stand in solidarity. But to take the race element out of it, because that applies to America, it doesn't apply to a lot of these countries in Europe, which shows that it really is, just as Michels points out, it's not really an ethical struggle, because these union workers, if they were in the same position as these scabs, would probably do the same thing. It's the wealthy successfully playing you against each other, but what it ultimately is, whatever the cause, is you've created a new class struggle within the proletariat. So obviously the rich have an interest in that because divide and conquer. And if you're in America where you can use race to do that, even better, because those are such hot button and divisive issues that, and race has such a real tangible effect on people's lives that they can make an argument that it should be primary over class struggles in America. And that's like one of the big arguments in the left now in America. But what Michel shows from studying this happening even in Europe among fairly ethnically homogeneous populations, that it's really just it's another class struggle. And in which case, the unionized skilled workers are the bad guys. They're the oppressors. Insofar as they try to stop the scabs from having a livelihood. And so, what does he say here? There's a quote, okay, one of the most indefatigable of French socialist women has well said. This is him basically just saying, like, look, guys, the scabs aren't bad people. This is just another class struggle. It's a reality. It's not, we're moralizing about this, but you would do the same thing if you were them. They would do the same thing if they were you, basically. But just to drive this home of their abject state. He's quoting this French socialist woman who says, quote, one is almost tempted to excuse the betrayals of these scabs when one has seen with one's own eyes all the tragedy of the unemployed in England. In the large ports of the South and West, one sees, ranged along the wall of a dock, thousands and thousands of famished people, pale, trembling figures who hope to be hired as dockers. A few dozen are needed. When the doors open, there is a terrible scramble, a veritable battle. Recently, one of these men, pressed on all sides, died of suffocation in the melee. And so that's, I think, a fairly compelling argument. But so what does that point to? Again, that's a social stratification that happens completely within the working class, that they establish themselves, that happens organically and naturally. Why would that fail to obtain in a formal party structure, where you have even more forces creating that? And so it's a compelling argument that this social stratification is like a fact of life. And so, yeah. So to go on, because we're starting to drag on a bit in this video, on page 275, he talks a lot about America. What does he say? The anti-alien movement is the outcome of the same professional egoism and is especially conspicuous among the Americans and Australians who insist upon legislation to forbid the immigration of foreign workers. The trade unions in such cases adopt a frankly nationalist policy. So again, we can understand why workers would do that. What's a good example of that now? We get to talk about the conservatives now. It's the Trumpers who see immigrant labor as a threat to them and their way of life. It's the exact same struggle, by the way, as skilled workers versus unskilled workers. It's like, I'm an American worker versus that's a Guatemalan worker. I should be of higher status. I should get more payment. I should get primacy. You shouldn't give any of my share of the pie to that person. It's ergomachia, battle for the feeding ground. And so, but what happens when your trade unions become nationalist? I mean, that's a somewhat conservative position. Yet again, you're beginning to identify the success of your party with the national interest, the whole people, with the whole people of your nation, and with the nation as an abstract concept. And so, that's another factor of this. And then in chapter 5, he talks about the labor leaders of the proletarian origin, and basically how this is not the possible solution that's been sometimes put forward is, okay, let's get rid of these intellectuals. If there's going to be bourgeois that are going to come into the party, I forget who he quotes. I think it might be Bakunin, who he quotes him at length, talking about how, like, if a bourgeois wants to come into the party, they have to sell everything. They have to live as a working person. They must be constantly reminded, you are no longer of the upper crust. You are no longer of a higher class than anyone else. You have to live as a working person and work for the cause. And to the extent we're going to have intellectuals, should be very limited. What Michels points out, though, is like the anti-intellectualism that, like, so there. We should understand by now where the anti-intellectual streak comes from, because there's this perception among the working class parties that there is always this like bourgeois element, and it's one of the things that drives their party to become more conservative and that diffuses the revolutionary energy. And so there's this idea of like, what if we expel the intellectuals? What if all the leaders are only of strictly proletarian origin? What Marx would have called Arbeiter, manual workers, strictly speaking. So there's two problems with that, and I'll just kind of briefly sketch them out rather than really getting into those texts too much. Michels basically just says, for one, intellectuals have always been there, and you need the intellectuals. We can't imagine a socialist party without some sort of intellectual backing to lay out the program, plot our strategy, be the brains of the operation. And this anti-intellectual streak is actually very harmful and destructive because the enemy has intellectuals, and they, that's an advantage to have, and you shouldn't rob yourself of that. Secondly, the leaders who are strictly of proletarian origin become a new bourgeois class themselves. What does he say? That it is hardly necessary, this is page 278, it is hardly necessary to point out that it is an illusion to imagine that by entrusting its affairs to proletarian leaders, the proletariat will control these affairs more directly than if the leaders are lawyers or doctors. In both cases, all action is effected through intermediaries. It's the representative of the labor movement, the person who becomes a party functionary, an organ of the party. You've vested your power into a representative and thus given it away. You've ceded it to someone else to make decisions for you as an intermediary. In the modern labor movement, it is impossible for the leader to remain in actual fact a manual worker. Again, he talks about all this in previous chapters. There are specialized tasks for the leaders. They're not going to be breaking rocks in the coal mine and leading the party at the same time. That's not practical. And if your party ran like that, you wouldn't really have any leaders. And it wouldn't be organization. You wouldn't have the power of organization. Directly, a trade union selects one of the comrades in the factory to administer regularly to the collective interests in return for a definite salary. This comrade is, consciously or not, lifted out of the working class into a new class, that of salaried employees. The proletarian leader has ceased to be a manual worker, not solely in the material sense, but psychologically and economically as well. It is not merely that he has ceased to quarry stones or to sole shoes, but that he has become an intermediary, just as his colleagues in leadership, the doctor and the lawyer. In other words, as delegate and representative, the leader of proletarian origin is subject to exactly the same oligarchical tendencies as is the bourgeois refugee who has become a later labor leader. The manual worker of former days is henceforward a déclassé. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's obvious it means he's become declassed. He's no longer, and he gives some arguments as to how the love of power can seize the proletarian even more strongly because they're self-made men. And all self-made men, people who come from lowly origin and raise themselves up to a state of success, have a belief in their own greatness and have a belief on some level, well, anyone could really do this if they tried as hard as I did. I did it. And they tend to become even more tyrannical and self-obsessive. And he gives even some examples of that maybe we won't go into since it's getting so late here. But what does he say? Inspired with a foolish self-satisfaction, the ex-worker is apt to take pleasure in his new environment, and he tends to become indifferent and even hostile to all progressive aspirations in the democratic sense. He accommodates himself to the existing order and ultimately, weary of the struggle, becomes even reconciled to that order. What interest for them has now the dogma of the social revolution? And that's the most important question. I mean, I know I've been hammering on the idea of divergent interests this whole series, but that's really it, and he explains it perfectly well there. Whatever your revolution is based on, or even if you're just a reformist and you want sweeping, all-encompassing reforms of some nature or another, that means you're against the current social order. And what he points out is anyone who succeeds in electoral politics becomes part of that social order and dependent on it. And now they stand something to gain from that order continuing to exist, and they have something to lose from it going away. So what is the social revolution to that person at that point? And I guess, we're coming to the end here. What I'll do, so the last chapter, he just gives an argument for why we need intellectuals in the labor movement. Why you need them in working class parties. He sort of says, like, look, what is it? Here, there's a quick thing from the last chapter. He says, in 1894, at the Frankfurt Congress of the German Socialist Party, a committee was appointed for the study of the agrarian question, and of the 15 members of which it was composed, no less than 9 were intellectuals. This is a manifest disproportion, especially when we remember that among the leaders of the German Socialist Party there is an exceptional numerical preponderance of working-class elements. But the committee in question had to deal with scientific problems, and these could be solved by those alone who had received a scientific education. The same thing happens whenever legal, economic, or philosophical problems have to be treated with technical competence. In a word, whenever the questions under discussion are not fully comprehensible except by those who have made a prolonged and profound preliminary studies. Cases in which the self-taught man is incompetent present themselves daily. So that's on page 303. It's basically the sum up of chapter 6. Like, this whole idea of, we'll get rid of the intellectuals, and that's the thing corrupting the Socialist Party, it's wrong. You can't have the technical competence to deal with a complex legal question that might arise, and he says presents themselves daily, without somebody who is a lawyer. And so you will always have a need for that, because that's just the blunt reality of the situation. And it's, again, this idea that organization is putting people into the areas of their respective specialty and letting them get good at it, which creates a meritocracy. That's an uncomfortable thing if you believe in pure egalitarianism. But he's saying, look, you can't remove this element, and it's always been a part of the socialist movement for a reason. But what I wanted to go back to, so that was just to wrap up. So we're done with this whole section, this whole part of the whole embourgeoisement of political parties, of how that happens, and the course of how that happens. And he's basically just described, we've been kind of leading up to, like, all these things creating oligarchies. What we've been talking about this whole time is separate class. Whether they become labor aristocrats, whether they're the electoral class at the head of the party. But what I wanted to go back to at the very end, where he talks about the American labor movement. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because it's very familiar to today. And we'll close out with this reading. It's page 288. He says, "We cannot wonder then that North America should be preeminently the country in which the aristocratic tendencies of the labor leaders, fostered by an environment often permeated, as has just been explained, by a gross and unrefined materialism, should have developed freely and upon a gigantic scale. The leaders of the American proletariat have merely followed the lead of capitalism, by which the life of their country is dominated. The consequence is that their party life has also become essentially plutocratic. When they have secured an improved rate of wages and similar advantages, the officials of the trade unions, wearing evening dress, meet the employees in sumptuous banquets. At congresses, it is the custom to offer foreign delegates and even their wives valuable gifts, jewelry, etc. The special services of the leaders are rewarded by increases of salary, which sometimes attain considerable figures. We learn from indisputable authority that many of the labor leaders, and especially of the trade union leaders, regard their positions simply as a means for personal advancement. According to the testimony of the well-informed, the American working class has hitherto produced few leaders of whom it has any reason to be proud. Many of them shamelessly and unscrupulously exploit for personal ends the posts which they have secured through the confidence of their fellow workmen. Taken as a whole, the American labor leaders have been described as, quote, stupid and cupid, end quote. We owe it to Gaylord Wilshire, himself also an American and a socialist, that the following unflattering picture of the socialist leader, quote, he is a man who often expresses a social dissatisfaction based upon personal failure. He is very apt to be loud rather than profound. He is, as a rule, not an educated man, and his demands and urgings are based too often on ignorance, end quote. And then Michels goes on to say, we have even been told that not a few labor leaders in America are already in the hands of the capitalists. The union officer became a boss in the hands of an enemy, a scab, or to use a still more significant American expression, a labor lieutenant of the capitalist class. One final reading from this. The absence of socialist tendencies among the American workers, their lack of class consciousness, have been noted with admiration by distinguished writers and leading members of the employing class, who praise these workers for their exceptional intelligence and hold them up as examples to the degenerate and lazy European working man. So that's it. And I would dare say it seems like not much has changed. I would say the labor leaders are far more educated. Gaylord Wilshire, who he quotes there, says, generally not an educated man. I would say, well, they definitely have college degrees. I don't know how educated they really are. But they're definitely in the professional class among the union bosses nowadays, almost always. And, I mean, that picture of the unions was before FDR and the New Deal, which saw an explosion of, it was basically the president telling everyone to unionize during that time, and huge number of union protections and all sorts of things that bolstered organized labor happened in that period, and was the message of the Democratic Party more or less through, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then it kind of ground to a halt in the 70s. And nowadays, I would say we're coming back to a similar situation, where now it's like only 17% of Americans are in a union or something of that nature. And they're all organizations that have created labor aristocracies. The kinds of people who have a lucrative union contract, they're federal employees. They're people who, actually, here, this is what I'll close with. Seth Rogen, he got into a tweet fight with Ted Cruz. This was covered by mainstream media and everything. And this says it all. This is such an exemplary interaction that happened. He was just calling Ted Cruz a fascist over and over again because of his alleged role in fueling the Capitol insurrection. And Ted Cruz basically started grandstanding about how unreasonable Seth Rogen was being, and how, well, this is the Democratic Party, folks. They're definitely not, it's good if you're a California elite, but not if you're a working class person or a blue collar union worker or something like. He said he appealed to union workers. Seth Rogen's tweet response was, "I'm in 3 unions." And at that point, I was like, okay, fuck you, you piece of shit. What do you mean, like the Screen Actors Guild, the Directors Guild, and like the Writers Guild? Is that what you're saying? Like, oh, I'm in 3 unions. That I'm a union worker. It's like those are aristocratic unions. Those are unions made up of people who are millionaires and billionaires. So fuck you. That has nothing to do with being like. You don't need union protections. And yeah, okay, I'm sure they do need union protections in California for creative work. But, I mean, my God, like, the tone deafness of somebody like Seth Rogen, who is a millionaire. I don't even know how much money he has, but it's like that dude, he has no idea, like, of the life of somebody living paycheck to paycheck in, bumfuck Ohio, in a meth-riddled town with the population declining across the whole county, and the factory closed and everything fucking sucks, and you're, the union that used to that paid out your father and grandfather a halfway decent wage and gave them a good amount of benefits. All that work is automated, or it was outsourced, or they're getting the stuff made in some country where they can pay people, 20 cents an hour to make it. And all that went away. All your union, all your security, all your stability, all of your money, all of your wage security, that all went away. And like, the few places where unions are like struggling to survive is places like Nevada, where it's like a right to work state, but they're still fiercely organizing and trying to fight for all these people trapped in, a service-based economy during a pandemic who are getting absolutely fucking shafted. It's like Seth Rogen's not getting shafted. He's sitting there in his fucking mansion. So it's like, fuck you for equating yourself with that. But it's also, those are the few unions that exist. The other side of that, the other unions that exist, what are they? They're police unions, they're teachers unions, federal workers, they're creative workers in California. People who, they comprise that. If they are laborers at all, they comprise a labor aristocracy. But more than that, they're professional class unions. And so we really have become governed by the professional class in America. But as always, Michel's book, I think, very illuminating about the current state of affairs in politics. And I'm going to try and get through this book with just 2 more sections. I think we have 2 more videos to go and we'll be done. This has gone on longer than I thought it would because to both this video and this series. But it's cool. It's been good for me. It's been fun. Hopefully it's been fun for some other people. Maybe it has. But alrighty, we'll see you soon.